Hello, and welcome to the Institute on the Environment. Hello to our online viewers as well. My name is Kimberly Long, Events Manager here at the Institute on the Environment. I'm so excited to have everyone here for our second Mondays on Global Futures. So INE is an interdisciplinary institute committed to bringing together people to address complex shared challenges. And sharing knowledge and forging connections through gatherings like these is the work that we do. In that spirit, I want to start our gathering by acknowledging that our campus is built on the ancestral and treaty lands of the Dakota people. The University of Minnesota was granted this land through coerced treaties that were not fulfilled, making this place we occupy the unceded territory of a sovereign nation. It's important to acknowledge the people on whose land we live, learn, and work as we and our university seek to improve and strengthen our relationships with our tribal nations. We acknowledge the mistakes of the past and are committed to moving forward in respectful partnerships in search of collective healing, true reconciliation, and honoring the land together. So with that, we are going to start with a presentation, and then that'll be followed by a moderated present panel discussion, followed by a moderated Q&A. So to start us out, I'm going to invite Steve Pulaski and Justin Johnson up to do the presentation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kim. And it's fun to see such a big group of people here today. This is an exciting topic, I think, and so it's fun validation to see. We're going to talk today about a new project, Global Futures, that both Steve and I and others in this room have been working on recently. From the context of an angle of where do the environment and the economy converge? We are going to make a few comments here. Jay Coggins will be joining us in a moment, and then Nat Springer will be leading us through a discussion before we open up to the full group. But first, let me just start off by asking, who here knows what ecosystem services are? This is probably the most biased audience towards yes that you can ever have, and it was still only maybe 50%. So I actually want to start with this. It's a useful concept, but it needs to be put into context first. But to get to ecosystem services, we first need to recognize natural capital. This is the things, the biodiversity, the ecosystems that comprise the systems on Earth that are the basis of sustainable human well-being. And there's many ways that you could talk about this, but one way, as an economist, that I like to think about it is there's a lot of similarities between natural capital and economic capital, or other types of capital that we know are critically important to our economy, like human capital. And so what does capital do? Well, it gives us services. It gives us valuable things that we benefit from this stock of capital, and ecosystem services are the same thing. Specifically defined is that ecosystem services are the valuable benefits humans receive from this natural capital. And it's been a very useful way to express for people interested in making policy-relevant decisions on environmental policies, is to be able to express what is the economic value of these ecosystem services. Much more we could get into on that, but for the moment, I actually want to take a step back and to say that there's a huge need, especially in this world that's becoming more and more interconnected and more focused on questions of sustainability, on understanding the entire bioeconomic system altogether. We have much work, of course, already that does parts of this, such as thinking about how does human impact through the growth of economies affect the environment through something like land use change or deforestation here. There's also an amazing amount of work talking about how does a change in the environment filter through to some sort of impact on the economy, and here's actually where ecosystem services fit in. But this is one thing that Steve and I, and many others in this room have talked about for a long time, is why is there this interdisciplinary divide between economists and ecologists, or different types of models that assess different types of questions? And Steve's been working on this for quite some time.
Yeah, one of the things that I think I've really been spending the last couple of decades trying to do is to break down those barriers. As Justin said, this is a system. right? What happens in the environment affects us. We certainly do things that affect the environment. That's an integrated system. But oftentimes, the economic system in particular acts as if it doesn't depend on the environment, doesn't take full account of it. Most of our economic metrics are just things that go through markets. Many of the things that we value from the environment don't go through markets. So in the formal economic systems, they don't have value. They don't get value. Even though, of course, we know that they're extremely valuable to people, the benefits that people get in terms of clean water, health. I probably don't need to go beyond health this week. So a lot of what we've been doing, Justin's work and my work and many others in the Natural Capital Project, is basically to show if we make changes in the environment, we change ecosystems and how they function, how does that lead to changes in the provisions of things that we care about, clean water, clean air, species that we care about, recreational opportunities, and so on.
And so with those interdisciplinary divides that we tried to break down, well, how do you go about linking them? That's the main thing that we tried to do in Global Futures, is actually link models. And so we took two very well-known models. GTAP is probably the most well-known economic model. It's used for things like assessing Brexit and trade policy wars. And that's very well-known on its own. Lesser well-known, but also somewhat known, is INVEST, which is a tool from the Natural Capital Project here in Stanford and other locations that estimates the value of ecosystem services. But these are two totally different software pieces or solution methods or even just communities of people that do not speak well together, or at least frequently enough. And so our work was focused on creating this as one integrated model so that we could assess some of these integrated questions. More pointedly, the World Wildlife Fund asked us to do this question. They were deeply interested in what is the value of the environment on economic performance. And they actually were strictly focused on that question of how would a change in ecosystem services filter through to a dollar-valued macroeconomic change. And they wanted that big number. We wanted to actually create a model that made this a justified number. There's many people in the game who can come up with a big number. We wanted to build the foundation that would do this in a robust way. And that led to this summary report and the technical report, which are both now very recently released. We'll be skipping a lot of the details, but please do see these. The technical report goes into probably too much depth. But to jump to what's happened since we actually created the model for the World Wildlife Fund is, even before it was done, it started to generate a large amount of interest from other organizations. The one that I've been most involved with is Her Majesty's Treasury, or the UK Treasury. They've commissioned work to look at how does biodiversity fit into this, and Steve's been involved in quite a number of other ones as well.
Yeah, and just some of you may have been familiar with the Stern review of climate change, which was also from the UK Treasury. So the UK Treasury has said, well, they want to do a similar type of report, the Dasgupta review led by Sir Partha Dasgupta, a world-class economist, on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And Justin has been actually working closely with some of the staff there to try to get in, what do we know about how biodiversity and ecosystem services and those changes, how does that lead to demonstrable changes that we can measure in economic systems. So other symbols that you see up here, so the World Bank, we're doing a number of projects right now with the World Bank, one called the Natural Capital Index. So how are countries doing in terms of their management, be it land use or air quality, relative to what they could be doing in terms of their resources and generating benefits to people. One other symbol up here on the right, the circle, Chinese Academy of Sciences. We're doing work with them on something called GEP. So you've all heard of GDP, gross domestic product. This is gross ecosystem product. And it's bringing into the accounting the value of natural capital and ecosystem services. And that's the goal. The Chinese government, they want to actually have this tool so that they can manage in a way, not just looking at the economic numbers, the traditional economic numbers, but broadly speaking, how do changes in the environment, how does that affect the things that people inside and outside of China care about?
So what did we actually do in this project? Well, first we started with the thing that Natural Capital Project often does is measure ecosystem services. We focused on 6 ones here. It's pollination, coastal protection, climate regulation, fish provision, timber provision, and water yield. This is just the set of the ones that we're able to calculate globally, and we felt it had sufficient evidence to connect it to an economic model. But we did not get all of them, so all of our numbers we'll present later are conservative in that sense. We're only including the ones that we can measure. And the way we measured them is also done in a scenario setting. We didn't want to just measure what is the current value, we wanted to inform policy. And so a typical way to do this is to say, let's create one scenario, business as usual, call it, that continues in trends of in very heavy fossil fuel use, widespread land use change, and essentially take the current bad trends that we have now and go into the future. And that's represented by a land use land cover map, or some sort of spatial representation of what that world looks like. But then we compared that to our global conservation scenario, the map on the right, which identifies a variety of changes in consumption patterns towards more sustainable products, widespread changes in land use, diminishing the amount of expansion into natural lands that agriculture does, but also just much less climate change, which helps on its own. So with these 2 maps, it's difficult to see any differences at a global scale, but when you zoom in to look at the specific results that we calculated for ecosystem services, you can see some really interesting patterns. This one here is the pollination service focused in on the area around Ghana, under business as usual in the top and under the global conservation scenario below. It's worth noticing that overall there's about the same amount of services provided, but they're in very different locations. And this is the nature of what our global conservation scenario did, is it said, okay, if we need to have this much agricultural expansion, if it needs to happen, where can we put it so as to minimize the loss of things like pollination storage? So we have results for all 6 of the ecosystem services that show high resolution results like these. But sort of the bottom line metric that we get to, the bottom line result that WWF wanted was, even though GDP is a flawed metric, it's a powerful one. And we found that protecting ecosystem services is very valuable. The numbers are big. And so global GDP, if you follow the business as usual scenario, we would lose almost $10 trillion between 2014 and 2050, specifically from losses in ecosystem services. If we then pursued instead the global conservation scenario, just barely, but it's slightly positive. This is a result WWF really wanted to see, and I was convinced at the beginning that we weren't going to get a positive. It was just going to be a lot less bad. But it actually was positive, lo and behold. So that was fun. The other results that we can look at are, there's a wealth of stuff that comes out of this. We see that the changes in GDP are very heterogeneous. There are winners and losers, and that will guide much of the discussion of how to implement something like this. And then finally, the last result point that I'd like to make is another unexpected one we found, is that investing in ecosystem services is a pro-poor strategy. The way we identified this is just illustrated in this graph at least, is when you look at how much of a change is there in lost GDP or any of the other metrics, and how much difference is there in different income groups, we see that the red bars, the low-income countries, stand to gain the most from switching from the business as usual to the global conservation scenario. And this is primarily for a very logical reason, is that in developing countries, low-income countries, people rely on the environment. It's a common public access good, and it provides a huge amount of value. The thing we'll end on, and then we'll transition to Jay, is that the broader context of why WWF asked us to do this is kind of an exciting moment in the environment. Is it's conservation's super year. That was their terminology. Is that 2020 will be a year where we set a number of important goals and have very large convenings. One of those is the Convention on Biological Diversity will set new goals for how countries will commit to saving biodiversity, but also the Sustainable Development Goals will have their first assessment period. And in many of these cases, there's a huge demand from these conservation organizations to have a quality way of answering what is our progress on this so far. So I'll cue that up just for more discussion in the future because I think it frames what we may want to focus on. But for now, I actually want to transition first to Professor Jay Coggins, who's going to talk about one of the academic next steps we're hoping to focus on.
Thanks, guys. Well, I just want to give a brief taste, a little bit of a tease about one thing that might possibly become number 7 in the list of ecosystem services that find their way into this elaborate state of the science model, and that is air pollution and air quality. Our paper that Rick Burnett had in NAS last summer with a bunch of other people says about 8.9 million people around the world die early each year because of fine particle air pollution. And you might imagine that comes mostly from smokestacks and cars, but it turns out that's not entirely true. Let me just give you a couple tastes of why this is a good fit for being added to the portfolio. One is it has enormous spatial variation. What we've got here is a figure from Andrew Goodkind's paper a couple years ago in PNAS, showing, let's look at the one on the left here. That's Los Angeles County in Southern California, and it's showing the dollar damage caused by a ton of PM 2.5 pollution across the county, and how huge the variation is spatially. Dark red is in the thousands of dollars of damage caused by a ton of emission of this fine stuff. But up in the corner of the county, it's yellow. That's in one county. The Clean Air Act regulates air pollution at the county level, and this is the amount of variation there is. So spatial resolution matters a lot. Spatial resolution like what INVEST can do. It's also the case that it's not all about combustion of fossil fuels. This is another chart from Andrew's paper, and it's showing that, a lot of this pollution, here we've got, excuse me, several pollutants along the bottom, ground level elevated. Sure enough, SO2 comes mostly from coal plants. But ammonia, which becomes particles in the air under chemistry, a lot of the contribution there is from agriculture. A lot of the contribution is from roads. Land is also killing us. Wildfires contribute quite a large share of this. So it's not just about the built environment. It's just not just about industry. It's about land. It's about what we do with the land. And the dollar value stakes are enormous. It also turns out, this is my last quick point, that the state of the science reduced complexity model of all of this was developed here. It's called InMap. And Julian Marshall and a couple of his people created it some time ago. Julian has left us, but now the Jason Hill's lab and Sumil Thakkar they're the proprietors of the build out to the global InMap model. So the people are here, the best at it. It's a spatial resolution. It's about the boundary between the human economy, the natural world, and human health. And maybe there will be a place in the conversation the rest of the afternoon about all those things too. Thank you.
And so now I believe we'll be transitioning over to a brief discussion with Nathaniel Springer. And then we'll be, after that, transitioning to a broader discussion with the audience.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nat Springer. I'm a research economist here at INE, and working with these guys as well. And I could just say quickly that I was at a meeting with both Justin and Steve about a year and a half ago where they were talking about this project and kind of planning how we're going to do this and stuff. So it's really exciting to be here at the end to see, that have a big impact. And so I just wanted to start a discussion here before we have a Q&A. And the first question I thought we could talk about is, you have your two scenarios, right? That you looked at this, generally you have your kind of business as usual and then your conservation strategy. So what kind of actions and policies does the conservation scenario inform? You looked at, you have both the global and the local scale. So maybe you could talk about some examples of how this information can inform policies and actions.
Sure. I can start with that, and Steve, feel free to chime in. There were two different levels, really, that actions were taken differently in the global conservation scenario. First off, at a core scale of which countries, which broad regions should have land use change. This was actually something that came straight from what are called the shared socioeconomic pathways. This comes from the IPBES, or Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. But this is just like from models, where in general is it good to have expansion? We used their sustainability scenario, and so implementing those things was the basis for what we did. The other thing that we did, though, and actually let me pause, the reason why we decided not to stop right there is because when we crunched the numbers on that scenario, we found that it was still a loss. Is that the broad scale changes were not enough to completely ameliorate the losses that we expect to see. And part of the skeptic in me was not surprised by that. But we were challenged by WWF, I think, in a very productive way to go further. How would you come up with something that was positive? And it was kind of an unexpected thing at first, in terms it wasn't supposed to be in the project, but we then set out to answer the question, well, how would we try to get a positive result? And the main thing we looked at is not at this broad scale, but at the very fine scale. What if you have targeted expansion of agriculture, such that instead of within a course country asking what is the correct amount of agriculture, but say, what if it happens here versus there? And it turns out by targeting in that way, very much more ecosystem services can be preserved. So to answer the question, Nat, is I think the types of different things that people or policymakers might consider important is both the broad scale distribution matters, but also then once you know what that distribution is, which countries are going to do it, the specific locations also matter.
So one of the advantages, Justin mentioned working with this group GTAP, Global Trade Analysis Project, and they really are an econ model, much more so than Invest is. One of the advantages of working with them is that you can then actually ask a much more explicit policy question. Like, what happens if there is a tariff that's put on a certain good? What happens to trade patterns? Therefore, what happens to demand for products, which is what drives land use? So there's sort of a direct link between policy world and what happens on the ground, which we're able to do much more explicitly with a model like GTAP linked to Invest. So it's not just tariffs. You could ask the questions like, what would happen if we put on a zoning policy, kind of what Justin was talking about. What if we're really focused in on particular areas and trying to promote certain kinds of uses in particular areas, or discourage certain kinds of uses in particular areas? So you could think about, redesigning agricultural policy. Actually, one of the lines that I have used previously, but I think it was the UK Environment Minister who was opening up our session, which is also kind of a thrill, but they said, what we really want to do, what the UK government wants to do, is redesign their policy so that they're using public money for public good. It's like, in a way, that should be obvious, but we don't often do that, right? We don't often use our public finances really targeted toward those things like providing clean water and habitat and so forth. But anyway, that was an explicit part of what they were interested in doing.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. I also was thinking, I was looking at your maps too, just thinking about, it seems like it's pretty obvious that, like you said, some areas really benefit and others don't. And even just in terms of the potential impact you have, is there specific places or things that certain regions can do that you found out of this? Or was there, are there hot spots of like either places where you can get the biggest bang for your buck for services, or even like, in policies or things that consumers or governments or other people can do? Maybe you could give a couple examples.
Well, sure, yeah. First off, the biggest bang for the buck typically occurred in lower income countries. This was for two reasons, is both they had a lot more of their economy dependent on ecosystem services, so when you protect them, it's much more valuable. But also there was much more potential to optimize and to make better choices. So that's kind of the hot spot. But in terms of what policies in particular, I'm going to actually reference some exciting new work that's come. We mentioned that we will be working with the World Bank. We're already about halfway through the project. But they came up with what was kind of an interesting perspective. When we first started working with them, they said, your global conservation scenario, it's not at all about policies. It's actually an outcome. You've sort of said, this is what should happen. This is the specific land use map we want to see happen. And they referred to that as an outcome scenario. And they very much didn't think in that way. So they challenged us, not that they didn't find it valid, but they challenged us to think about it in what we then started calling policy scenarios. Is not what is the land use map that seems to be better, but rather what is the specific change in policy that leads to a land use map that our model says is better. And so for there, the ones we're going to look at are payments for ecosystem services targeted to specific grid cells. Also trade policy could potentially be used as a lever here. Like what if we put tariffs on goods according to how damaging they are to ecosystem services? That could be a potentially very powerful lever. But a lot of this is yet to be determined because we have to run these results now for each of these different policies to start to have a systematic way of answering that question.
Yeah, and, I'm sorry. I think to me one of the things that and you've talked about this a little bit that makes this a really ambitious approach is you have the global scope, but at least with Invest and the way we're trying to connect this, I mean you really get high resolution information. I mean, this applies to the air pollution. This is what you were saying too, Jay. And that's really hard to do, and especially when you're bringing like you say, economic and environmental researchers to the table here. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about how you did that, on what was challenging, and really why that you feel like this was a problem worth tackling in this way.
I'll start, and Justin's gonna laugh because I have a way of saying, well, we could do that. That's not so hard, and then it's 6 months of Justin's life down the drain. But conceptually, the point is like we know these systems are linked, and we know that as the map that Jay showed, I mean, where things happen matter, right? I mean, if the air pollution is happening 100 miles to the east of Los Angeles, that's not affecting the people who live in Los Angeles. You actually have to be spatially explicit in that way. Water pollution, habitat, almost all of these ecosystem services, it does have to be local. Pollination, I mean, the pollinators are, they're constricted to 1 or 2 kilometers. So if you're not modeling at that scale, you're not actually capturing that service. So it has to be local. Now, the problem, of course, is that when you're working with a World Bank or even just the government of China, all of China is like all of the continental US. This is a huge area. So you do have to be able to keep the fine resolution, but go up in scale, right? It's just massive amounts of data that you have to keep. That's why it's wonderful to work with people like Justin and at Stanford Rich Sharp, who are really great at manipulating large data sets and not losing their mind. I would lose my mind doing that, but they keep this all straight. And why do you have to go up to that scale? I mean, you could just do local analysis, but there's sort of 2 things. One is things fit together. Just think about river systems. So we could look at the Blue Earth watershed in Minnesota, but that's part of the Mississippi. And if you're going to think about the Gulf of Mexico and the hypoxic zone, you actually have to model all the watersheds in the Mississippi to really get at that scale. Also, governments work at that scale, right? I mean, so you can't oftentimes just think about a local area. You have to be able to scale up to actually say something about U.S. farm policy or what the government of China is interested at sort of China-wide scale.
When I just, on your first comment, Steve, we actually have a word for it when he says, yeah, that could be done. We call it Steve Easy. It's logically consistent that it could be done. But that's often a far step from actually can be computed in finite time on a computer. But on the other hand, this is why it's fun working, because there are certain challenges that it's really rewarding to see if we can solve that computational challenge, and this is one of them. We didn't have time to mention it, but even just being able to run Invest at the global scale at 300 meters resolution, that was a huge challenge, and there's a whole article on that if you'd like. But the point is, a lot of that started because it was logically consistent. It was important. We should do it. Well, why not then? And so we were able to cross some thresholds that way, and so I've appreciated that. But in terms of what methods have arisen, I think this will be a discussion that I know will come up again and again, because it's formed a lot of the discussions here at ION-E even. Eric Lonsdorf, Nat, many others here have talked about how our models interconnect by whatever name we'll call it, but multiscale modeling. Is that we model something at a grid cell maybe, and at a country, and these need to be able to be very easily transitioned between the two in a systematic way. Other types of data like supply chains, it's not just a different scale, it's even a different type of data. And now we're talking about sources and sinks of things moving around. But the point is, there's a ton of value to be had in being able to move across these different modeling scales so we can integrate these models. And that's where air quality comes in. It might be a little easier in that sense than a supply chain because it is spatial already. But it's just this whole new realm of detailed spatial data that I think we can bring into this mix.
Excuse me, I think one of the exciting things about the work these guys are up to, and don't mistake this, I'm not here because I'm part of their work, I'm an admirer of their work, I would love to be involved with their work, but these systems
Say no more.
These systems don't respect the boundaries that people draw. Rivers don't, they cross from one country to the next. Certainly air pollution crosses from one country to the next. And what I find so exciting is that the GTAP framework, that engine, is precisely about how goods cross boundaries and what it means, and being able to map all these natural systems and the air and water pollution burdens that we impose on the natural world and each other onto those countries and account for the exchanges between them and among them is just super exciting, and I don't think there's any place else that's doing it quite in this way.
Can I mention one other thing, which is this is obviously not just the work of those of us sitting up here right now. There's actually a lot, and this also a lot of the work is being done here in Minnesota. So you mentioned the air pollution modeling before. Jennifer Schmidt, who's sitting in the back of the room with Foods Cubed, is looking at spatially explicit models of supply chain that we're talking about integrating into this. So, next question is not just talking to governments, but talking to companies. Like, well, where are you sourcing your material? And if you sourced your material in a different way, how might that improve the environment? Another person I'll mention who's not here right now, obviously, is Bonnie Keeler, and over at the Humphrey Institute. And she has a project called Create. And in particular, what Create does is it's looking very much at who benefits, like what's the distribution of consequences. So, if we're changing air pollution in a city, are people living in North Minneapolis benefiting from that, or is it just going out to more advantaged groups? So we're just scratching the surface. There are many parts of this in much more detail that hopefully we will continue to develop.
Yeah, that's really great. And I think it's a good follow up on that is thinking about you guys have taken the step of bringing together two pretty distinct models and putting them together, and you talk about let's bring in some more. Let's bring in Jay's work and InMap and Foods Cubed. I mean, maybe you can talk a little about your philosophy of integrated modeling, because it's a challenge, and maybe just talk about what that means and how you think about bringing these pieces together in a way where they actually work. Because that's a big challenge, and that's a big piece of the work that I think there's a reason that a lot of people don't do this, and I think overcoming those barriers is important.
I'll start, but I turn it over to these guys. I'm very question driven, right? And questions in the real world mean that you have to go beyond boundaries. Like, if I want to understand something about what's happening to water quality, like, I have to understand, first of all, what's driving the farm sector. And then I have to understand something about hydrology, and maybe I have to understand something about policy and institutions and economics. So the questions themselves drive the fact that these have to be interdisciplinary teams that address them. I guess I hear this, that interdisciplinary work is hard. And it's like, I don't subscribe to that. I subscribe to the fact that if you have a clear problem and you say, I need your help in order to be able to address this problem, the teams tend to come together. At least, I don't know, maybe it's just because we're all good Minnesotans here and we collaborate. But my feeling has been, or my experience has been, that clear focus on the problem, clear delineation of what needs to be brought in terms of disciplinary expertise goes a long way to helping get this interdisciplinary work off the ground.
And I would just add very briefly to that to say that when you do take a question seeking or question answering approach, what happens some of the times when you're not in such a supportive interdisciplinary environment is, number one, the researchers want to guide the question towards what their model can say. And that creates a bias about only answering in the way that we can. But also, the more honest researchers maybe would be led to say that, well, we don't really know how to answer that question. And so we don't have an answer to that. But the problem is, in the environment, so many questions are ones where if you say no comment, we don't know yet, the decision will still be made by default because the developer will have to build somewhere. And so in that context, the prospect of saying, well, that's kind of outside of our model's expertise is just very unsatisfying. And so that's sort of our way of filtering what we focus on. And so then it's essentially, what's the biggest question? Why hasn't it been answered? Is it really not just because these two models haven't talked to each other? And usually it really is that they're written in different software languages or something like that. Or you don't have any postdoc that knows both of the two models. And so in that context, just breaking down these barriers, it's actually a pretty small task to describe what we did, is we just glued these two models together. But the fact that we did that now allowed us to answer these questions instead of just saying, that's not my discipline. Now we can say, well, here's at least our first attempt, and if you don't like our answer, we at least have a very clear model that outlines all the specific ways that we got to that answer. And so that enables us essentially to not have to just say, you go make the decision how you would without our information because we're not ready to have an answer.
And I'm going to put you on the spot, Jay, but maybe you can talk a little about how, as an example, you guys are talking about, bringing in a new model here. And, I think that speaks to what you said, Justin. There's optimism that you guys can do it, and there's, and I think it'd be a really great addition to have air pollution. So maybe you can talk about, in this case, really, how do you go about taking something from air pollution and connecting it with a model that currently doesn't have anything like that? Is it as simple as writing some code, or is there some communication barriers that have to be overcome? Is there, what is really the path to bringing in a new model? Because there might be someone in this room who says, hey, I got this awesome model. It would be a really good 8th step here. And really thinking about how we bring in all the different components, I think, is and having a bit of a sense of how you might go about do that is a really useful conversation.
Well, I'm not going to pretend to be prepared to put InMap into Invest/GTAP. That does sound very hard to me. The spatial resolution will be a little different, and the data sets for InMap, global InMap, which is a model that connects emissions of these various pollutants from any spot on the planet to its impact in all of the grid cells downwind and upwind, which can be hundreds of kilometers away. Some of these pollutants travel a long ways. That's what InMap is doing, and it's doing it at this very fine spatial resolution, not 300, but 1,000 meters on a side in high-density parts of the world. So, Justin, I'm trusting that you're going to be capable of working with Sumil and other people, of adding that new component to this very elaborate, enormous data set and make it run in Python or something.
In Python, yeah, sure.
Good. Should be easy.
Should be easy. But really, for being realistic for a second, this is why I got so excited and why I invited Jay here, is because I do think it's very doable, is that they have a gridded model of the world in InMap, and the Invest conception of the world, the philosophy it takes, is also gridded, and so there's a lot of similarities there. Really hard was going from a gridded model like Invest to a regional model like GTAP, where instead of grid cells you had very large country boundaries. That was the big challenge. But what I do foresee as probably one of the biggest things that will be difficult is with Invest, we always have a very easy to define, clear sense of what's probably going to change, and that's land use, land cover. And so most of our models are driven, I showed the 2 different land use, land cover maps up on the board by the differences there. But with air pollution, it's other types of information are going to be needed, not just that this is industrial land or developed land, but well, what are they making there? This is the sort of detail that I know InMap has, but we've not typically dealt with things at that specific of a scale. So I'm excited to see how to solve that, but I can see it as being hard too.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's the data as much as it is the methods in the model, and that points to the challenge of bringing these together. I think ultimately one of the places we want to go with this, and you guys have touched on this quite a bit, is we talked a little bit about policymakers, but really what you're doing is you're creating a framework so that we can evaluate decisions that people might make and how those different decisions might improve or make the environment worse. So I think one of my big questions when doing things like this is, well, how do we actually do stuff and put a scenario together and build a model and produce results, but then actually the people who can actually make these decisions actually pay attention. They actually do something about it. So what is your guys, you have a lot of great connections. You have folks in different realms who are using this information, obviously the World Bank. But what do you guys see as the next steps to taking this model beyond that to I think, Steve, you mentioned prime time, thinking about what do we really do to scale this up so that folks can really use this to make those policy decisions and or individual decisions or corporate decisions that actually have an impact.
I mean, a lot of this comes back to, first of all, making whatever you're doing, the modeling and stuff, relevant to the decision that's actually at hand. Now, the good news on this front, frankly, is that 10 years ago we might have had to go try to bang down the door at the World Bank or a major corporation. Now that is no longer the case. It's really the case that people see the importance of working on natural capital ecosystem services. So it's almost, for us, figuring out what's the most important, triage, like what's the most important thing actually to work on. So, but anyway, part of this is being practical and listening to what government or corporation, what decisions are they actually making? What information are they missing, which is typically a lot in the ecosystem services realm. But what that really means is linking their levers, like what could they do? Supply chain in the corporation's case, or a policy change in a government agency case, or how they allocate their budgetary resources. How does that then actually translate to something that happens on the ground? So there's that link. And then with the ecosystem service models, how does that change in what's happening on the ground change the things that people care about, be it water quality or air quality or whatever? So it has to be relevant to what they're deciding and what they care about. And it also, frankly, has to be, it has to reach a certain level of reliability. And I'll just mention that for a moment, because if you're doing global scale analysis and then somebody says, well, you know what, I want you to analyze with your global model what's happening in my backyard. Probably not up to the level of sufficient detail that would actually tell you something. So you have to also be careful a little bit in matching kind of the reliability or scale of your model with the question at hand. And part of that's just working in this space enough to figure out, like, when do you have something that's really reliable and helpful to that policy decision or the corporation's decision?
And I would add one more reflection on that. Communications. I think everything Steve said is correct, but then once you have these results that are relevant to the decision maker, I think part of your question, Nat, was also getting to how do you scale up, is communicating the results, so it's not just the technicians at the World Bank, but also their bosses or just general people who are interested in this. And the story that I'd share that actually was quite a learning experience for me was working with WWF. they do great science, but the people we are working with were much more focused on communications, and they kind of knew the number that they wanted to get, and they knew how they'd spin it. But I mean this in all respect, is working iteratively with them to figure out how could we express different versions of our results in ways that were useful for them, really helped us hone our message, I think. And so, some of you have the glossy infographic that we've sent out here. I had a clip of it up on the screen at one point. That's not something you'd create for your average journal article. And they created it for us. All we had to give them was an Excel sheet. It was great. But interacting with them, saying, is this correct? Is this true? Have we pushed the truth a little too far on this? Constantly going back and forth, I think, was very fun for me. And I see how it's increased the take-up because everything has been digested into the policy-relevant report rather than just the technical report, which is what we wrote. So I think that was a lesson for me.
All right, well, I think we're going to open it up to questions. And Kim's going to be coming around with a mic. So please raise hands and she'll take questions.
Got one in the back.
Hi there. Thanks so much for the presentation and the project. I've got a question in terms of impact. So you talked about the World Bank, needing this data, looking at the effects of climate change. I mean, essentially, you're looking at what it is that we need to do now in order to avoid larger scale devastation. So, are you thinking in terms of refugee movements, people who need to migrate because the ecosystems the eco services are no longer being provided? Are you feeding that back then not only to the World Bank but also to governments, to state governments, to the people who will actually need to be much more aware of the small scale changes that you showed in the maps rather than the large scale look? Big question, but
yeah,
impact.
I can start with that. Is that this is a model that doesn't have population dynamics, and that's a very important point. You're right. I think a lot of the damages that we've just sort of lumped into GDP. The specific ways that they would be enacted would be reflected in different migration patterns and stuff like that. We don't have that level of complexity, but it's a fascinating idea and ought to be included. But in terms of, nonetheless, unless did you have a point on that? Okay, you had a thoughtful look. But in terms of scaling it down, part of it we have the caution that Steve referenced about getting to such small scales, it gets harder and harder for the models to make accurate things. But what they do is set the broad parameters for what the discussion should be about. And so you see that in this region, these are the factors that are driving the losses. So I think that could inform the discussion. But
yeah. But we actually, so some of our models are global, but actually a lot of the work that we did, like before 2 years ago, most of our work was fairly regional, smaller scales, and so that's kind of our bread and butter still. So one of the advantages of that, let's just take, we did work in a watershed near Mankato a while ago. It's called 7 Mile Creek, and what we did, this was actually a project from Pollution Control Agency. They wanted to know, in the Minnesota River Basin, we're going to have to meet water quality standards. That means reduce phosphorus inputs into the Minnesota River. Much of the Minnesota River Basin is heavily agriculture. 7 Mile Creek certainly is. So the question was, how could you change practices in 7 Mile Creek or land use in 7 Mile Creek in order to try to meet these water quality goals? And if you did that, what else would you be gaining? What other ecosystem services, either habitat, carbon sequestration we looked at, so sort of kind of, recreational opportunities, sort of things that are beyond just the water quality. And so, this analysis can show you where, coming back to an earlier point of yours, where there are hotspots on the landscape. Where is it really important actually to try to change land use because of the slope, because of where it's flowing into the water, and what would you have to do on that land in order to meet these goals? Doesn't have to be, we could suggest one thing, but we can turn this over to the land managers in this area and say, you play around with it. Here's, change the land use patterns in this configuration, and here's what you get. So we haven't, frankly, done as much of that as is clearly possible with this kind of with the technology, but you could do these kinds of things and show, in a way, it's like, what if I'm changing the land use here? How does that translate into better water quality downstream or better carbon sequestration and so forth? So there are lots of specific things beyond. This comes back to our more local as opposed to the global. But we do things now with the World Bank, with the government of China. So the government of China is very interested in restoration. So a question that they're asking, they're setting up a new national park system. If they set up a new national park system and they provide restoration or protection of ecosystems, what do they get from that? What's the benefit? So these are the kinds of things that, we can do some push. We can say we can create these kind of analyses, but you also have to have, and increasingly we do, the willing demanders, the people who say, we're really interested in this. We want to improve water quality. We want to improve the other ecosystem services. How do we go about doing that?
If I might, another way I like to think about impact, it's not exactly your question, is the environmental justice way. And if you think about the 6 ecosystem services that were shown on the screen earlier, certainly air pollution as well, climate change in general, the people most affected tend to be the least advantaged. But the flip side of that is, if you're smart about improving things, whether it's better forest management, cleaner air, you're likely to do the most good to the least advantaged as well. But for that, and to do it right, you really need to know a great deal about where people are. Spatial resolution is all important in bringing about those policy changes and in evaluating whether you achieved your goals or not. So that's one way these models can have a tremendous impact.
There's a group, the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium, that's trying to start an ecosystem services market in the next couple years. I'm curious if you guys have been part of that and how that, creating that market would then give you guys scenarios to run, or if you've already run them and have suggestions on how they should play out that market, or been involved in that at all.
I've been at the edge of some of this for a while, and we've been at meetings and we've talked. So part of our work can help inform, like, if they get a market up and running, you need to know, like, well, if I do this, like, what water quality credits am I creating? I mean, what is the actual benefit or cost of doing certain things? There has been a lot of talk about ecosystem service markets. So, back in the Obama administration, they were pushing, actually even may have been in the Bush administration prior to that, these ecosystem service marketplaces like in the Department of Agriculture. Frankly, from my perspective, the main challenge on these things is, as I mentioned before, many of the ecosystem services are public goods. So, you can pay farmers to do certain things that will create them, but where does the money come from? So either is it if you were like the UK and we used public money for public goods, that's where the money could come from. But if it's truly a private marketplace, then you have to ask the question, who's going to be the demander of these goods? And maybe it comes through corporate supply chains. Although, frankly, I've seen a lot of them, and you have too, where they'll say we want to do the right thing, but then it's like going to bump up the cost of their product by 10 to 20%, and they're less interested. So, there's the question about, like, how do you actually create the demand for this? And it could be through enlightened consumers, but it also may be, frankly, from public policy that says this is something that's good for society, and we're going to create the incentives so that people who create those public goods actually get rewarded for doing so.
Thanks. You've spoken a bit about kind of this need for demand for ecosystem services and for making these what I would consider positive changes. But if I understood the presentation right, there would also be negative change implied. And you kind of talked about, you know, if agriculture needs to expand, where can we do that that will have the least damage? What is the implication of trying to target those negative changes at a global level, either for policy or for trade?
I'll start. So when we talk about targeting, this really comes back to that point that I made, I think, a little bit ago about how part of what can be done better is the distribution. I think that's what you mean by targeting. Having it happen in one country versus another. But then also, it's still relevant. The flip side of targeting is, okay, if it's going to happen to this degree in a country, let's target the specific places it goes. And I think there's been a lot of work on that first type, the question of how shifting from one country to another would have big impacts on this. And so yeah, it's been a big part of the conversation. To me, the part that's newer is really okay, given that constraint that we're going to have a certain amount, how much better can we do? But there's also some interplay between these levels insofar as it might be the case that some countries, there's a lot more opportunity to do better. And so that can determine the national level distribution.
And one other aspect, I think you were getting at this, instead of creating public goods, like don't destroy public goods or reduce the damage that you're creating. And some of the results, I'll go back to the slides that Justin presented on this project. So business as usual going out to 2050, it's like, well, food demand is going to go up, and so there is going to be an expansion of agriculture, so you have to factor that in. Climate change happens, and that's actually one of the bigger reasons that under business as usual things drop. To me, it's like I want to be realistic about what the future trajectory is, and so it's not all sweetness and light. Sometimes you actually have to tackle like how, so there are some difficult trade-offs, like how are you going to increase food production, but do this in a way which is most consistent with the provision of these other ecosystem services that we want. To me, that's, in a way, it's sort of the flip side of the same question. Like, increasing more good or decreasing the bads, it's all about how do we do better with the resources that we have in place.
Thanks so much, all four of you. It's been a great conversation. I want to go back, Steve, to one of your really early comments about the GEP, and maybe at the risk of exposing my lack of understanding of economics and GDP, just wanted to have you say a few more words, or any of you, about sort of how they differ and what sort of future either policy decisions or changes governments or corporations would make if they were required to report on both of them.
That is actually an excellent question. Okay, so one of the things I mentioned early on is that there are GDP calculates, it is basically a measure of income. It's like the flow of goods and services, the value of the goods and services either created or consumed in a specific area over a specific time period, usually a year, right? So we usually report annual GDP, like how much, what's the value of the goods and services we created. Those are just things that go through the market, right? So something that does not go through the market, like I really like seeing wildlife in my backyard, but I don't pay for that. So that's not going to show up in GDP, typically. Or, if I have an improvement in water quality. Sometimes, actually, you get these perverse things. Like, we'll have, like, a storm wipe out something and you have to rebuild. It's like, well, that's actually a boost in GDP temporarily. There are, by the way, that's a well-known problem, and economists have solutions to that. Like, if you've lost something, you have to depreciate it first, to subtract that first and add it back in. But GEP is getting at what is the value of the goods and services that are generated by nature, So all of the value of these ecosystem services. Now, some of those actually show up in GDP also. So if we have more water that's being provided downstream, and that water is being used to irrigate crops, and those crops are sold in the market, that shows up in GDP. But the credit for what is nature contributing to that agriculture doesn't. So some of GEP is for things that are outside of market altogether, which are just not counted. And some of it is for proper attribution, like that's actually because nature did that. So why is that important? Well, that's important because now you think back to what decisions that companies or the government is making, like how do they influence things that show up in GDP? Well, maybe what they need to do is they need to worry about the watershed, either the provision or timing of water or the quality of the water, because that has value downstream. So you can tie this back to actions that they make. Specifically, how is China thinking about using this? So China is, for a long time, they have rewarded their local and provincial leaders based on how fast did your economy grow, as conventionally measured in GDP. Those of you who have looked at statistics of China, incentives do matter, right? And so China has grown phenomenally over the last 3-4 decades. They've put a high reward on that. But they've done that at a huge cost to their environment, right? Air quality back 10 years ago in any major Chinese city was abysmal. And they realized we need to now actually have, you can call it green growth or balanced growth or whatever, we need to pay attention to the environment. So one of the things that they're doing is to say we want a measure that is as powerful as GDP, that summarizes a lot of information, that on the environmental side, we can now start to reward local and provincial leaders for improving their GEP, not just their GDP. So it's still too early to know like how this is going to play out because the measures are just coming out and getting into practice. But potentially, this is changing one of the major countries on the planet in a way of how do they actually, what gets rewarded in terms of their policies and their direction. So, I'm excited to work on it. I don't think starting my career I ever would have thought that I'd have the potential to help shape something. And it may go bust, but potentially this has a huge impact and redirects policies and the form of the Chinese economy.
May I ask a question, Steve?
Yeah.
Just take a few of the richer countries. Okay. Do you imagine this ever happening in the U.S. and anything like the way you're talking about in China or in any country in Europe or Australia or Japan or the other rich countries of the world?
Yeah, hope springs eternal. I will say, so I got myself in trouble a few years ago. So I actually served on the board of the Nature Conservancy, and we were doing, the Natural Capital Project was doing work with the Nature Conservancy. At the same time, we were doing work in China. And the president of the Nature Conservancy was in the room, and somebody asked me essentially this kind of question, like it was basically saying, how easy is it to work with the Nature Conservancy? And before it was just involuntary. I just said, I find it easier to work with the Chinese government than I do with the Nature Conservancy, which didn't go over real well at the meeting of the Nature Conservancy. But right now, actually, China is at a moment like the U.S. was in the 1970s where we realized, we've done great on the economy and we're doing really poorly on the environment and we need to fix that. And so they're very open. Right now at the federal level, we are not open. So, I can't, I just can't say it any other way, right? We are not interested in this kind of evidence. We're actively trying to suppress it. Move away from it. Now, there are at the local level or the state level that's different. California is doing amazing things, and many other states are as well. And maybe Minnesota will pick this up. So we actually have a project. We work with people at the Gund Institute in Vermont, the Gund University of Vermont. And they're very interested in doing kind of a state level GEP kind of thing. And we said, well, okay, let's have a home and home series. We'll do a GEP in Vermont, and we'll do a GEP in Minnesota. Will this get picked up by, will Walls find this attractive? Or I don't know, but we're going to try. Hope, as Paul said, hope springs eternal. We'll try these things. Some of them will stick, and or maybe they don't stick now. Maybe they will in 10 years.
I hate when someone selfishly makes a speech instead of asks the question. So I'll suppress that, other than to say, I really envy you doing this, Justin, because I'm so old that I worked on national econometric models that we could run in Fortran, and must seem like a child's play to a guy like you. But let me ask a question about the model in this way. Could you tell us what sort of, in terms of outcome on greenhouse gases, how your scenario generates something close to which of the RCP paths, and how do the outcomes of your model compare with the outcomes of some other integrated modeling systems that are using that as their input or part of their output?
Well, great question. The first part is quite straightforward. We use the RCPs, the representative concentration pathways, as different inputs. What's that? Okay. Julie was saying something. So we take those as inputs, but I think what you're...
Got several paths then, rather than...
So yeah, so the business as usual is RCP 8.5, and in the global conservation scenario, that's based on the RCP 2.6, so the best of the ones. But there's the question that I'm wanting to answer there also is that we took those as just givens at the beginning of our modeling chain, but this all sort of seems like it should be endogenous, because as you're starting to affect the economy, obviously you're affecting emissions. And we're talking about very large land use changes, and the carbon sequestration differences are huge. So we haven't done it yet. We just did a one-shot comparative statics version of the model, just sort of played with the equilibrium. But where we want to go with this is run it year by year. And then we would be able to have endogenous climate change, is to see how would this play out where we wanted to directly change the RCP rather than just say, how is it different under these different climate change assumptions?
So you also have the ability, in theory, to generate... You also have the ability, at least in theory, and Steve Easy, to generate different combinations of granular policies that could get you to that particular path, 2.6, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. And I will say it's not so different than the Fortran days. We just add a few zeros.
Yeah. You got a little faster machine than I have.
All right, so my question might be a little bit on the technical end. I do computer modeling with like fluid mechanics. So if you imagine fluid flowing through like a tube and you have a curve or an edge, you want to have a more fine resolution in that region in order to pick up the details necessary. Is your program able to kind of make use of a change in your grid size for regions where it's more important to preserve that information? Kind of like going off of what Jay was talking about, where the pollution really impacts in very specific regions, and maybe out in the wilderness, maybe we don't care as much about that. I mean, we do, but as far as impact on a human, maybe it's not as big of a concern. Can you change the resolution in various regions in order to improve the computational time while still picking up that information?
Well, so that's a great question, and I'll actually start by saying that InMap literally does do that. And so it's 1 kilometer in the high resolution areas, but that's because we care about those areas. The grid cell actually expands to be tens or hundreds of kilometers across in North Dakota. 36. Oh, 36. In North Dakota, because, well, maybe not North Dakota with the plumes of gas, but other areas where it doesn't matter as much, we don't need to waste our computation time on that. So I want to learn from that, because the other 6 ecosystem service models that we have currently included, just calculate every grid cell. It's a fixed grid cell size model.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I think I really appreciate the fact that the team is working with people who are really having influence or making change on policy issues. Working with the World Bank and working with governments, I think that's really important. My concern here is with global analysis and global models or global recommendations, it boils down to the recommendation or the implementation challenges that those recommendations needed to be put into practice. When we think about, say, for instance, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, all those fancy goals and the targets and the objectives that they hope to attain, and I become skeptical sometimes because I'm like, is this very realistic? I'm concerned about the cost implication when it comes to putting some of those things into practice, especially in developing countries where, you know, before thinking about conservation, they're thinking about healthcare, they're thinking about education, they're thinking about all those immediate socio-economic needs that the people really worry about. Now, how do you reprioritize, you know, ask those governments to kind of sift their implementation strategies to these conservative approaches that at a global scale will help all of us. So those, like, how is the cost implication going to be addressed in these models or in implementing them?
I can start and then maybe, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that's a very good point. A lot of that, I think, will be addressed in this next phase that I've referenced with the World Bank. They challenged us to look at specific policies, and they have that same question in mind. And so just the flavor of the answer could be along the lines of acknowledging that, yeah, when you're asking a farmer in a developing country to do something different that might be more costly or forego something, how does that shake out? Well, one answer is, what if the solution involves large transfers from rich countries to poor countries? Or if a banking institution like the World Bank were to create funds of money to do this? It becomes a different question then. You still need to, there's still many implementation questions, but it's no longer just one of saying, hope they do it. It's saying, what are the payments we could offer that would offset them? But I recognize that, yeah, that's a big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. At the end of the day, this stuff has to not just sit in journal publications and in academia. If it's going to make a difference, you've got to convince somebody who's in a position to do something, whether that's a landowner, whether that's in the government official who controls an important policy lever, or whatever. I mean, we don't. And we, just to be clear, we don't actually ourselves, control those levers. What we try to do is to provide information to people who do control those levers, and frankly, working with the coalition of the willing, those who really want this information, who want to try to incorporate this. And so some of this information, I mean, I actually think a strength of our approach is the fact that we do look at these trade-offs. We can say, in an agricultural area or in, some of like timber operations or whatever, fisheries, maybe, you need to stop fishing so hard now in order to let the fish stock rebuild. Okay, over time, that's going to lead to higher incomes, but there is a gap in income over the time period. So we can show what those trade-offs are. Is the community prepared to make those choices, or how could we come up with clever policies so that, like a few years ago, we proposed this investment schemes. We know that fisheries rebuilding eventually has huge benefits. And the World Bank, for example, has a study called Sunken Billions, how inefficient we are with our fisheries management. Overfishing is bad for the fish. It's bad for the fish harvesters too. Right, so you can point out these things. But I think your question is a really good one, because policies really play out with how is it going to affect specific groups. Are they willing to actually do that? Have you got a plan to overcome perhaps an initial, like in the fishing case, the initial pain of there's going to be a shortfall of income over this time period? Do you have a plan for actually trying to overcome that?
I think another thing to at least consider, and I think that these models have a chance of revealing and helping us understand, is that there are low-hanging fruit out there in certain domains, in certain industries, in certain technologies, where if we're smart about it and we move in those directions, costs will go down. And that's probably true in a lot of the efficiency investments in energy use, in electrification of buildings and vehicles over the 20 years maybe. Renewables are getting so cheap. Things can change for the better and will save money in certain domains. I'm not saying across the board, but in food and agriculture, I think there's a decent chance at least that changing some of our ag practices will both put more carbon in the soil and cause food costs to go down. So in the places and in the times when that's true, these are models that can help us understand it. Let's do those. Let's do them yesterday.
Alrighty, well, we are at time, but I'd like to invite the panelists if there's any last words you'd like to say.
I'll just start, and then Justin, you can have the last word. So anyway, thank you all for coming. It's spring break, and I was sitting in my office, and I didn't see anybody for like 5 hours, so it's nice to actually know that humanity still exists. But I really do, so in these dark times, I take a real, Paul, you said hope springs eternal. And in this realm, there have been so many both community groups at the small scale all the way up to places like the World Bank or the government of China or the government of the UK, for that matter, who said, we recognize that we are in an extraordinary time, and if we're going to actually be sustainable, we need to do something like that. We need to integrate the economy and the environment. It's not just a luxury. That's a necessity going forward. So, I'm glad that we get to maybe contribute to this, and I think there's a larger swing and a movement, and I take encouragement from that.
This isn't strictly about ecosystem services, but I just want to acknowledge that I am thrilled that Justin will be my own colleague in a few months, and I'm trusting that his connection to IONE is always going to remain strong. Thanks for giving him to us.
And I just end partially similar to the note that Steve had on optimism. I mean, we have been very grateful for the positive response we've gotten so far, and that makes me happy. And I think, but it also speaks to the huge variety of different topics that need to be assessed, sort of as the obvious next steps, air pollution just being one. But on that, I think I'd actually end with a technical point, is that this sort of integrated modeling is possible. We did it, but we just did one small little angle of it. It's possible, and I think it'll be a growing area for academics, for businesses, for a lot of different perspectives, is that we're living in increasingly complicated times, and the disciplinary divide is not just one that we need to break down in academia, it's one that we just need to break down because the problems are interdisciplinary. And so it can be done. It takes a flexible approach and a little bit of saying, yeah, we can do that. But I think this is where a lot of development of new academic ideas is really going to come from in the next few years.
Great. Well, thanks, Justin, Jay, and Steve, and thanks to everyone for coming.